So in this video, we're going to implement classes to manage the data about our cycling and running workouts that are coming from the user interface. And so here we have this diagram again containing the classes that we need to implement. So we already discussed this before, and so let's use this as a base for working on the classes now. But let's also at the same time take a look again at our form to make this a little bit less abstract. Okay, so what both the workouts have in common, so both running and cycling, they have a distance and a duration. Both of them also have a type, of course, but that we will not have to encode anywhere because for that we are already creating two different classes. Then for running we have the cadence here, and for cycling we have the elevation gain, as you already know. And then what's also going to be common to both workout types is of course the coordinates that are basically coming from the click on the map. And so let's now start by implementing the parent class for both these workout types. And so remember, that is simply going to be called workout. So workout. And so again, this one will take in the data that is common to both the workouts. And so that is the coordinates. Let's just call it coords, the distance, and the duration. Okay, and then just as we learned previously, we say this dot coords is equal the coords that we get as an input, this dot distance equals distance, and then the same for the duration. Now we could also make these private fields, so basically private properties, but I think in this example we are good like this. We just need to keep in mind later for the speed and pace calculations that this one should be in kilometers and this one should be in minutes. Now what we also want for each workout object is a date. So that's going to be the date where the object is created. So date, and let's simply set it to new date. And so we need this one here to then implement what we have here. So this description of August 20. So here. So basically the date in which the workout happened. All right. And then besides that, we also need an ID. And so that should be a unique identifier. So remember way back in the Bankis project, where we also had an array of objects. And so here we will do the same eventually in our app class. Remember? Now having that array of objects, sometimes we need to find an object in that array. And so back then in the Bankis project, we used defined or defined index methods for that. Remember? However, these methods only work if there is something by which we can search. So some kind of unique identifier. And in the Bankis project, that used to be simply the name of the account owner, but that's just not a good practice. So instead, any object should have some kind of unique identifier so that we can then later identify it using that ID. So let's create a field for ID here as well. And always keep in mind that what we're doing here, so here and actually also here, is using a very modern specification of JavaScript, which is not even yet part of the official JavaScript language. Remember how I talked about that in the last section. And so if we want to make sure that this is going to work at least with ES6, then we would have to do this dot date, and then define that here, and the same here, this dot ID, and then define that here as well, right? However, here I'm simply using cutting edge JavaScript. And so something that's probably going to become part of JavaScript pretty soon. And so I think that it's perfectly fine to use these class fields here already. But now back to the ID. And in the real world, we usually always use some kind of library in order to create good and unique ID numbers. So usually we should never create IDs on our own, but always let some library take care of that, because this is a very important part of any application. However, right now I'm not going to include any library like that, and I will simply use the current date to create a new ID. So new date, and then I will convert that to a string and then simply take the last 10 numbers. And so that should then be unique enough. All right. So converting to a string, and then I can say slice, then the last 10 numbers basically. So this is the workout class, but we will never directly create a workout. Instead, we will always either create a running or a cycling object. So these are the child classes. And so let's create them here. Running extends workout and also cycling. So class cycling extends workout as well. Okay. Then here we also need a constructor. And remember that this one should take in the same data as the parent class and then plus the additional properties that we want to set on a running object. So coordinates, distance, duration, and then remember the cadence, right? So that is what's unique. Well, let's do that here actually. So that is the part that is unique about running. And then here we need to call the superclass with these three. Okay, so the common ones that are common to the parent class. And this will then initialize the this keyword. And then here we can say this dot cadence is the incoming cadence. And then let's simply copy this also for cycling. And here what changes is the elevation gain. So let's check out our diagram here. And so we already have these five. So we have ID and date actually as fields, and then distance, duration, and coordinates, we defined them in the constructor method. Then for the running and cycling, we already defined the cadence and the elevation gain. Now what's missing here is for running the pace, and then for cycling the speed. And so let's actually calculate both of them in each of the class. So in this one here, let's create a method for calculating the pace. So calc pace, and no longer calc age for a change. And so the pace is usually defined in minutes per kilometer. And again, that's unless you are in the US, which probably uses miles per kilometer. So of course, you can also use your distance here in miles. But anyway, all we need to do is to now create this dot pace. So adding this new property basically. And then all we need to do is this dot duration, which is the minutes, and then divide it by kilometers. And so that is the distance. So this dot distance. And that's actually it. All right. Now it might also be a good idea to return this data in case someplace in our code we actually need this. But what we will do instead of relying on this return is to simply call this method right here in the constructor. And so remember how I said in the last section that it's perfectly fine to call any code in a constructor. And so of course we can simply do this right here. And in fact, we did the same here in our app class. So here we also did a lot of different stuff in the constructor, and we didn't even set any properties here, right? So we use the constructor here to immediately calculate the pace, And so next up, let's do the same here for the speed. So the speed is measured in kilometers per hour. And so this dot speed, so not clock speed, but speed, will be equal the distance and then divided by the duration. So the speed is basically the opposite of the pace. So this one is duration by distance, and this one is distance by duration. However, this duration is not in minutes, but in hours, right? And so therefore, we need to first divide this one here by 60. And then we can also return this dot speed, even though right now that's not yet necessary, because we are simply calling it right here. And we don't need the return value at this point. Okay. And now let's just add a comment here. So this one is for the architecture. And then I'm adding like a small divider here. All right. And then let's actually test out these classes. So let's create a run here. So that's new running. And let's see what this class needs. So we need coordinates. And so that's going to be an array of coordinates. And let's just specify this here. So basically kind of as documentation. So an array of latitude and longitude. And so if we have some other developers, they will then know exactly what this coordinates should look like. And there are other more fancy ways of writing documentation, but maybe we will explore that a bit later in the course. But anyway, let's pass in some array here of latitude 39 and longitude -12. And this should then be somewhere in Portugal. Then next we have the distance, and let's say 5.2 kilometers in 24 minutes and with 178 steps per minute. And let's actually do the same for cycling as well. So how do we call this? Is it a cycle one? Maybe it's a cycling like this. So let's use the same coordinates. And then here, let's say we did 27 kilometers in 95 minutes. And the elevation gain was 523 meters. All right. And now we can log both to the console really quick. And so again, this one here is not really part of the application. Okay. This is just to experiment if our classes are indeed working as expected. So going to our application, then you see here that we have our running and our cycling. So indeed, we have all the data that we specified. That includes the date. Then here the ID looks a little bit off. And the reason for that is that I basically used a new date, which is going to be an object. And so transforming that object to a string will then basically become all of this here. So this string. And so we then took these last characters. But let's fix that in a minute. But anyway, here we have the pace calculated as well. And you see that this is of the type running. And then in the prototype, we indeed have the calc pace method that we just defined previously. And in cycling, we should, of course, have the calc speed method. And here it is. Okay. And of course, this one itself has another prototype, which is then the workout itself. Now, this one doesn't have any methods yet, but we will add them a little bit later as we keep moving on in the project. Let's now fix this ID here very quick. And so instead of using new date, we are going to use date.now, which, remember, simply gives us the current timestamp of right now. And so that will now hopefully fix it. And you see that here we have this ID. And then here we also have the ID. But right now, they're actually exactly the same. And so basically that happened because they were created at the same time. But then later in the real world, as we use our application, of course, it's going to be impossible to create two new objects at the same time. And so then that's going to work just fine. However, as I said previously, when you are really working on the real world, then probably you have many users using the same application, right? And then, of course, some users can create objects at the same time. And so by then, relying on the time to create IDs is going to be a really bad idea. All right. So let's get rid of this experiment here. And so for now, at least, our classes here are complete. As I said, we will keep adding some more stuff to them, but for now, we're fine. And so with this, we are now ready to move on to the next video, where we will then use these classes to actually create workouts from the form.